We are live now.
We are?
We just went live, yeah. Okay, so. Welcome everybody, thanks. I actually got into Paul Cisek's work from somebody from the forum posts, just trying to keep up with the type of things they're working on, and then I mentioned it to you, Jeff, at some point, and you're like, well, go read the paper and come tell us about it. So that's what I'm doing. There's actually two papers here. There's this one, which is older. This is 2007, where he introduces this affordance competition hypothesis, which is sort of the idea that I want to explore and compare and contrast to our ideas. But I'm also going to go back to this paper, which is much more recent, which goes through this thing, phylogenetic refinement. Okay, but let me. I'm going to bounce around here a little bit because I think it makes more sense if you understand what Dr. Cisek's intentions were. So even
quick question.
Yeah.
And he's been active on the forum, is that right?
He doesn't have an account, but I've emailed him a couple times, and he's given me more information on some of my questions. And he mentioned that 2 forum members have been in touch with him as well. But he's totally cooperative and interested. The people are interested.
Do you think he might listen in today?
He probably will.
Okay.
Yeah. So hi. I hope you do. But I've been talking about him on social media and on the forums. There's been a lot of discussion about sort of these ideas and how they overlap with ours. But let me get back because there's sort of a root cause, I think, of a lot of his work, and it's sort of rebuking some older ideas about how to create a taxonomy of brain function. So this top area here is sort of the old way, or something that he's sort of trying to break down and saying this isn't the right way to look at things. When you talk about the brain, you don't break. It's hard to make it make sense when you break it up into perception, cognition, and action. So I'll go into a little bit more of that. His ideas go into the phylogenetic sort of taxonomy of evolution of the brain to try and give this bottom taxonomy of brain function, which right away breaks it up into action, selection, and specification.
So is he talking about the entire brain, or is he talking about neocortex?
He's talking about entire brain,
but there's phylogeny, then you're going to be talking about the entire brain, probably.
Yeah, but there's repercussions to neocortex. Based on the whole evolution of the brain, what is the neocortex doing in relation to that? So I'm actually going to jump to the newer paper now because it's got some really good ideas, I think, about this before we go into the affordance competition hypothesis. But this is really, I think, sort of situated to rebuke that old idea and present, a better understanding of it based on the biology. So again, he presents this old view, and he's talking about how this isn't.
That old view could apply to cortical thinking. But
the cognition perception action thing.
There's these sensory areas that do perception, and then there's these motor areas that do motor behavior, and there's other areas we don't know what to do. We'll call them cognition.
Yeah.
But when you show the other diagram, that sort of implied entire brain ideas. So.
These 2 diagrams?
So I looked at the top one, I said, that could be the old way of thinking about the neocortex.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you talk about, I guess when you say,
when you
talk about phylogeny, then that gets much more interesting. It's just, then it gets much more relevant to the old brain structures.
He does say the top one is the classic cognitive science view of things.
There you go.
And the bottom one is an alternative.
You can see how quickly it all breaks down in action, specification, and selection, so it's all basic ganglia.
Yeah, exactly. So
note here, there's object recognition over here, and this is really a what versus where.
We would make, and I would make a very concerted distinction between cortical structures and subcortical structures.
Yes.
And so if you look at the cortex, the evidence right now is that all cortical regions are doing the same thing basically, and they all have a motor function.
Right.
So you could describe all these things that might be, planning and behavior are all going to be in a cortical column. That's our belief.
Yeah.
But if you start talking about, and so I see object recognition, well, that's cortex, right?
Yeah.
But then, as Foyne just said, if you take action selection and so on, then now you're talking about basal ganglia stuff. So it's kind of mixing it all together, and it makes me a little uncomfortable.
The affordance competition idea really is a theory, I think, mainly a theory of cortex.
Okay.
He does take into account all the inputs to the cortex, and he wants to look at this from a historical evolutionary viewpoint to see. Here's how the cortex evolved. What was it doing a long time ago?
Okay, because that's interesting. Because usually, Mountcastle's hypothesis is that the cortex, of course, didn't evolve through phylogeny in some sense. It got big by replicating one thing.
Definitely.
And the old brain is still viewed as,
but it evolved to do that thing before it started replicating it a bunch. So he's sort of saying what's. Let me get a little further.
I'm just trying to understand what part of the brain we're talking about here. I'm not being critical. I'm just
right, and I think we'll understand once we get to some of these charts that we'll get to. So let me just get down here and talk about. Let's just get to the main chart. Okay, this is basically the research that he did to try and identify all of the phylogenetic sort of branches along the way from neurons all the way to cerebral cortex to try and create a new taxonomy, not based on cognition, action, perception, but sort of at a whole brain level, but trying to understand that what is cortex in this new taxonomy. So let me go down to keep this in mind as we move on to this other chart here where I know I'm jumping around a lot, but this makes a little bit more sense. If you keep that taxonomy in mind, here's how he sort of split it out until we get all the way from the pallidum to the cerebral cortex, and that's where he's breaking out this action selection versus specification taxonomy.
So that might be like the what, where.
Yes, it's exactly the what and the where, and that's in the other paper too. So we'll get to that as well.
Can I just look at this for a second?
Sure. So, and one of the reasons I like this, the way he's done this, is because I've always, it really seems like actions are going to be represented in a similar way as objects are represented in different parts of the brain. There's reference frames involved in both. There's attractors involved in both that are resolving to things. There's pooling involved in both. And I think that his idea of affordance competition is extremely similar to our idea of object unions, object selection. So that's why I really liked his approach to this from a completely different sort of angle, coming to a lot of the same ideas about neural codes and attractors and stuff.
There was this really good video that explains sort of I think you put it out, where he explains sort of like the origins, right, of these older brain structures. And the main point I got away from it is that you never replace like an old structure, right? And all the basic things like food seeking, rest, circadian rhythm, they're all still there. It's just that you get an additional structure that then modulates that. It's like, you can rest, but not under these circumstances. Yeah. And you're still going to do food seeking and going to have but there's a modulating thing now which can suppress it for a while.
So his argument is all of this evolved before cortex really came about as a way to do motion selection and specification. Those are the sort of the two terms that he's using. And in the older brain, this is the dorsal. You know this better than I, I'm sure. The dorsal pallidum grew enormously. The pallium, sorry.
I think pallidum is a venue for concerts.
Is it? Oh well.
I don't know.
But we maybe can better understand the complete function of this based on looking older. Let me go back to.
So I want to make sure I understand this. So there's this argument that the older brain structures evolved under some architecture he's arguing for, and that is also how the cortex works, or
I think so.
Okay.
This, let's say, let me try and use the right terms here. Where did I miss out? I lost it. So here, before, say, the pallium expanded. It was under pressure to perform a certain action in response to movement of an organism. As it expanded, then it incorporated all. It's the same sort of thing that we say that the cortex did when it expanded. It started doing all these other things using the same mechanism.
Well, I think that, again, and go back to Mountcastle's original proposal was this structure here evolved through evolutionary time, adding new structures on top of old structures, and that goes back to the mid-1800s. But that idea, right after Darwin came out, people said, "Hey, look, the brain evolved by just adding new things on top of old things, and they control the new things, control the old things."
Right.
And then Mountcastle said, but that's not the way it happened in the neocortex. The neocortex found this one sort of maybe a derivative of the structure,
Right.
And then which I would probably like. And then just replicated that a lot. So 70% of our brain is not done, wasn't evolved in that regard. It was just replication.
And that's the green part. That's both of these green parts. It's all neocortex, and he's saying it's doing all of these things now, understanding the Mountcastle perspective, and that it's the same cortical circuit essentially, with perhaps different functions in different places.
Okay. Well.
So let me a couple of conclusions from this paper that
Can I just ask you, because
Yeah.
you had the big circle around action selection, and
Yeah.
you labeled it objects, and then you had a circle around action specification and called that actions. That mapping, is that your addition to this? Or
That's
is
my
it-
addition to it. I
Or
can't
is that-
find it now.
So him
Here it is.
grouping it into objects and actions. Yeah, that's I
Yeah.
mean that's Matt's writing on there.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand. So action selection, are you calling that objects because actions happen?
I'm calling it object because I think that it's happening within the reference frames of objects, and the actions is happening within the reference frames of sensors. That's what it seems.
Well, he also has in the paper. They say object recognition down there.
Yeah, which is a part of it. But when you reach to grasp something, your whole brain in both streams is resolving to do the thing. There's an object representation of what you're grasping, and then there's a motion representation of your movement to the thing. And I think that's the separation we're talking about here.
Maybe it's a little hard to, I have my own way of thinking about this, and so right or wrong, it doesn't matter, but it's my own thing, so I'm trying to map it on this. It's a little harder. I try to be much more, in our thinking, much more homogeneous in the way of thinking about all these different cortical regions. And so to me, every region is essentially creating reference frames and performing actions.
Right.
But the actions in the what pathways are actions of the object itself in the object space. They're actions in the object space, and in the where pathways, they're actions in the body space. And so you basically have this. They're both doing the same thing. You're selecting actions relative to an object, and you're selecting actions relative to your body. And so action selection and action specification would be happening on both sides, just different reference frames.
The terminology is a little loose here,
It's
but
a little, so I'm
but
trying
I
to
think
map
it's the
these, map
same
these words. It may
idea.
be the same thing,
Yeah.
maybe not.
I think it's the same thing. That's the angle at least I've taken on this. It seems very much like the same thing.
But you have to read into it because I just look at these words. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, shape.
It gets a little
sensitivity.
clearer.
What's shape sensitive? Shape of what?
I
The
don't
object,
know.
or the shape in my body space. It's really hard to say. So that's why you have to read these words very carefully and read the text very carefully to understand what's being proposed. But it's not obvious right up front. But I'm not saying you're wrong about it. It may be just different ways of thinking about the same thing.
There's some more where stuff in the second paper I'll get
Yeah.
to in a moment.
You had some quotes.
Yeah.
Could you go back to the previous diagram for a second?
Was it the bearing one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why do they have hippocampus laminated on top of the neocortex?
Oh, so this isn't like a
This is not
proper map. It's more of like a how things are connected map. It's warped in space.
So hippocampus literally is on the far edge of the neocortical sheet. It goes hippocampus and then entorhinal cortex.
Nice and broad, you can drill through the skull, over the ears, and you're directly in the hippocampus.
Okay.
Because the cortex isn't big enough yet that it
Yeah,
pull it around.
and in humans it goes around the other. So it's literally the neocortex is this sheet, and then the sheet continues and it morphs into other structures which are sort of less homogeneous, less uniform. And so I think this is just showing physically where it's connected. This is not a time evolution diagram. This is just
Right.
I want to understand what it was trying to represent.
I think it's just representing what areas are
Just like it's taking
close
the
to
cortical
other
sheet
areas.
and flatten it
Yeah.
out onto the screen.
Okay,
Yeah.
but the
Unwanted.
proximity is just connectivity here. That's what
it's
it
just
is.
physical
Yeah,
proximity
like
in the brain.
retrosplenial cortex is very tightly connected with the hippocampus.
Okay.
And I think traditionally, if you think about the cortical hierarchy, people often think about the hippocampus as being on the top. Like you don't have that many direct connections to the lower levels, but more to the higher.
Yeah,
levels.
and retrospinal, so hippocampus has a very different architecture than neocortex. It's got some similarities, but it's still a laminar structure. The retrosplenial cortex is somewhere in between. It's closer to cortex in terms of the architecture, and physically it's also like, the retrosplenial cortex in humans, if you follow into the big, crevice in the brain here, it's a sort of inside. It's like just like it shows here. You go from real cortex to retrosplenial cortex to hippocampus, and you're losing, as you make those transitions, you're losing sort of the common architecture, which slowly morphing into other related. So, yeah. I don't know.
So let me go back again in evolutionary history. There's some interesting research in this about how just behavior evolved, and he does try and tie all this work back to just the basic need for behavior, which is interesting, I think, when you think about a very simple chordate or lamprey or whatever, and what it needs to do to move. And I mean, in a very simple respect, all of this may have evolved from simply observing an object and either going away from it or going towards it, taking an action to either get to the object if it's food or to avoid the object if it's a threat. And at the core, those things may still be what's driving even object recognition in a way that motion and objects are almost always tied together. From an evolutionary standpoint, we take action in response to objects always.
I'll be careful about wording here. There is one of the arguments we've made very strongly in the book I'm writing, is that the cortex doesn't always take actions. In fact, most of the time it doesn't take actions.
Sure, but conceptual action.
Well,
right? I mean,
maybe
thinking. If you think of thinking as an action,
you can think of it as you're building a model of the world, and that's what the cortex does. And at any point in time, you can use that model to behave or not. But you can read a book and not really taking any actions, but you're expanding your model of the world.
I agree with that, for sure.
So in the beginning, I don't think that was the case. In the beginning, you take a little simple animal, it's like, input leads to action, and so many people still have that idea that's how the brain works. They say, well, the only thing that matters is how you behave, so what's the input, how's it going to lead to an action?
Yeah.
And now in the cortex, inputs don't always lead to actions. They lead to basically invoking the model and knowing where you are, and then you can evaluate what you want to do after that. So I'm piecing apart the words here to be careful that we don't always say the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. So
at least from his perspective, it seems to me to reinforce the idea that actions and objects perhaps are more integrally tied together.
Yeah,
than,
I would agree with that.
one would
Although I
think.
think as we go higher up into the cortex, the actions can be separated in time.
Yes.
From the recognition of objects and where you are.
Yeah, I think
sit
so.
there and think for a while before you take an action.
Right, but that separation is sort of added post fact on top of existing structures where there was no separation between those.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which we nowadays understand to be sort of difference between instinct and or impulse.
Yes.
Okay, let me get to a couple conclusions from this paper, and we'll go back to the affordance competition. So I like this because he's going against the idea again of cognition, perception, action as sort of the taxonomy of cortex, saying that if the cognition hasn't entered the picture, it may be because we haven't gone far enough, or because cognition as a dedicated and separate system is a concept that's incompatible with this phylogenetic history that he's talking about. So he's sort of turning cognition and saying, is that even a useful term to use right now, which makes sense to me. And I like this. Consider how that architecture of nested feedback control, there's a loop involved here, which is the action perception loop, which has been extending. This is sort of philosophical, but it's been extending further and further into the world for so long. The ability to take action and affect reality for so long evolutionarily might have just kept extending into increasingly abstract domains of interaction, which is really what we say the cortex did as it expanded.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting, and it would lead to the alternative explanations of many capacities often considered hallmarks of cognition.
So he's essentially, if you correct me if I'm wrong, is he essentially arguing here that there is all these things we think of, maybe some people think of separate things, are really the same thing, which we agree with.
I think
but
so.
maybe he's using slightly different words than we would use it.
I think so. Okay, so let me go back to the affordance competition, and we'll step through. I won't go through all of it, but so when he says affordances, it's sort of a loose term, right? But I see it as sort of any representation or attractor for movements, movements or actions or something. And from the moment a few pages into this, I was like, affordances are objects. It was almost obvious. The way he was talking about affordances and how they're selected was the way we talk about objects.
I would think about affordances normally, like at least in product design, which is not neuroscience, but product design affords is the suggestion of a behavior based on an object structure.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a good
That's
a good
Like a
definition.
coffee cup or something
Yes,
like that.
yes.
Yeah.
You know.
Thing that implies you can act on this.
So look at Marcus's water bottle there. There's a little
Yeah.
tube on top. It suggests that you should get up that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's an affordance.
So what he's saying is that when you, let's say you're catching a ball,
Yeah.
not a coffee cup, but a ball, something's coming at you, all the actions that you need to take to catch that ball sort of pool and are resolved as reality plays out, and it attracts to the movement.
That's funny because that example of the ball, I think is actually. Did he use that one?
No, that was mine.
Okay, so
Maybe it's wrong, but that's
well, it's
what
not
I
wrong,
thought.
but I think it's not the best example because that kind of behavior could be all subcortical, right? It's like, hey, something's coming at you. Either get out of the way or you catch it, right?
It could.
But if you take something like the coffee cup or your smartphone or whatever
Mhm.
it is, there are real affordances of that. You look at that thing, you see the icons on your smartphone, and you go, oh, well.
Oh, you're making decisions.
It's just, they suggest different things.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that one suggests if I touch this, it'll do this, and that one suggests if I do that, and that, and Marcus'
Right.
water bottle suggests the little thing on top of hinges,
Right.
the little round thing there.
You're saying you can catch a ball without your like prefrontal
Yeah,
lobe
yeah,
getting
yeah.
involved.
Catching was like, that's one of these things that's just like, wow, act immediately or you'll be dead type of thing.
Yeah.
And it's really not a good example of cortical thinking, which is you've got a complex structure and you're deciding what to do with that structure, and the affordances are what the structure suggests. Like I just mentioned Marcus's water bottle. It has various suggestions of what I might do with that structure.
The experiments he
I think
talked
that's a
about.
water bottle, isn't it, Marcus? I've never seen it before. Sorry.
Let's all look at the water bottle.
But that requires some knowledge, doesn't it?
Well, it requires prior knowledge, yeah. So you have a model of the world, and I see this new string that I've never seen before. It's clever that it matches Marcus's shirt, and it has these various things like, oh, that suggests how I might use this because I've seen other things that have things like that. And
But I guess Paul Cisek's point is that this is even more general than cortex, right? So like this affordance competition hypothesis sort of like starts even earlier on, like the simplest circuit for just the bacterium, like 6
so, but
seconds.
here's what I want to. Yeah, I agree, but I think that I like to make the distinction that the stuff that's earlier really is input action. It's always the bacterium is always going to turn left or right or straight. That was it. It doesn't sit there and go, let me think about the world.
Sure. Yeah.
Whereas when it gets to the cortex, we don't always do that. We sit there and look at it for a while. Maybe we don't do anything. Maybe I'll just remember Marcus's new water bottle.
Right.
But, so somehow we sort of separate out that immediacy of behavior selection. Like the brain is always not just selecting behaviors and acting. When you get to the cortex, the brain is often not doing anything. It's just learning and sitting there thinking about it.
I'm interested to know what you think about this next chart when I get to it.
Okay.
So a couple things I underlined here is perhaps concept of separate perceptual cognitive motor systems, which theoretical neuroscience inherits from cognitive psychology are not appropriate, which is again the same argument
we would
he's
agree
been
with that,
taking.
Yeah.
Um,
I would agree with that.
Let's see. So his proposal is that the processes of action selection and specification occur simultaneously in dorsal versus ventral streams. I got that backwards. Ventral and dorsal streams.
So that gets a little wonky for me. I'm not sure why I would break it up that way.
Let's
why he
look at
breaks it
this
up
then.
that way.
So this was hard for me. I'm not really sure I understand this, but I've labeled the what and the where streams here. So the interesting thing in here, I think, is this pool he's got right here. So what he's identifying here, I think, is pooling, action pooling. So he's talking about the dorsal stream originating in striate, cortex, and V1, moving over the dorsal area, and saying that somewhere in I can't remember the exact names of the brain regions, but there, where I've drawn that arrow, is essentially actions being pooled, and the experiments that he
What do you mean by
referred to.
pooled? When you say actions being pooled, what
So
do you
let me get to it.
Okay.
So let's take an experiment where it's a reaching task, and there's two objects to reach to, and the macaque or whatever it is somehow taking the action before knowing which one is actually going to be the target, right? And so he showed experimentally. Let me find the right thing here, if I can find it. He's got this whole model based on these experiments, but essentially he showed that multiple simultaneous affordances are represented in this area of cortex
So they show that as a measurement, a concrete empirical result, like we're measuring these activities, these cells, and see them multiple active at the same time?
I'll have to look at that. I think these are based on experiments, but I didn't go back and look at those. There was another paper about it, and I decided not to go another paper.
There's two ways you can go about this. One is that the brain is simultaneously representing all these things at the same time, which is a pooling.
Yeah.
Right. The other way is I look at an object like the water bottle, and I attend to different parts.
Right.
As I attend to different parts, I see different affordances at each moment. So I look at the handle, and I say, oh, it can be flipped up and down, or I look at the ring around the top and say, oh, it can be unscrewed. But I may not think of those things at the same time. As I attend to different components, so there's a serial sort of affordance selection versus a parallel one. Maybe both are right.
I think the core of the competition means the parallel thing.
Because you could compete serially, right? You could go ding.
Yeah, he didn't necessarily specify between those two things, but I assumed he was talking about parallel attractor, essentially, codes that were competing for selection that resolved through time as it became more evident which one was appropriate for the task.
Right, where eventually then one suppresses the other.
Yeah.
One wins out.
Yeah.
And some of the...
It doesn't happen at the start, it happens at a later time point. That's the point.
Yeah, and he's got experimental data on this. This is hard to read. So the left one's, I didn't want to go into this, but he's replicated this in an experiment where he created the cellular structures. This isn't deep learning. These are actual, neural simulations. This is a bit over my head, honestly, but it made sense to me from the standpoint that this shows multiple affordances being represented simultaneously until an action is decided, and then one of them moves forward.
Could you expand the acronyms SC, CC, and GO, please?
No. I mean, I don't I'll have to look. Spatial cue, the go signal, I guess that means go. But
Spatial cue, color cue, and go.
So there must be some simple task that's being represented by color in space.
There's a completely other paper on this, and I read a little bit of it, but I decided to try and focus on.
If I just extrapolate one likely scenario, and I think we've kind of talked about this here before, is that as you attend to different components on something, each one suggests an affordance or behavior.
Yeah.
But maybe as you do that, they pool, right? And so as they don't just all appear at once. You attend to the different components, say, yeah. And as you're doing that, maybe they're being simultaneously represented, and then you select one and they inhibit one of those. So it could be a combination of the two.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think an attention mechanism is important to this process.
So let me note a couple interesting things. I took some notes on this. He noted that there's different parts of parietal cortex involved in this dorsal stream, and that for example, lateral intraparietal is involved in eye control, and the reference frames involved in that part of cortex during affordance competition is body-centric. Mm-hmm. And then the medial intraparietal, which is arm reaching, is hand-centric. So that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to point out that aligns with how we think about reference frames in the dorsal stream. And he did note that...
That was an empirical result?
I don't know. I read it. Yeah, here. Concerned with control of gaze, Snyder, etc. Yeah, those from results. And then another thing I wanted to note, these are just all my notes. Okay. This was a big conclusion I think I took out of this. An early role of what is now the ventral stream may have been the detection of stimulus combinations that were relevant for selection of actions in a particular behavioral context, looking back in evolutionary history. And this may have eventually evolved into the sophisticated object recognition ability of mammals. I think this aligns with how we think cortex evolved. Okay, a couple of things I noted also. He was talking about competition. K-winners fits in here pretty well if we're talking about the type of competition between these representations and how they might be selected. Whoops. He does note activity is weaker when they have both affordances present. They're if there's only one, it's a stronger signal.
I guess that would depend on exactly how you're measuring that. I mean, our union hypothesis, we're literally doing a union of sparse representations, both signals are they're still as equally strong.
Yeah.
But depending how you would measure the strength of that signal, you might conclude otherwise. Right?
That's true. I don't know. That would depend. I guess that concludes this. I just thought this was very interesting to see someone coming from such a different angle, like phylogenetic sort of taxonomy angle, and reaching a model that feels really similar to how we talk about objects being represented in space.
The first diagram you showed at the very beginning, where he was carving up things, I'm not sure.
Was it this one?
No, earlier.
Okay, it was probably. I showed this
Yeah,
first.
that thing, aren't going?
No, there was another one. I'm sorry, I'm remembering a green blob at the bottom. That one.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. That's how I do things. So he split off physiology and never went down further on that, and I'm wondering why that really makes sense, because
Well, could go up again. This is it. There's no stroke. Yeah. Well, he's got metabolism, replication.
he split it up into the neural tube. I mean, you have the endoderm, the ectoderm. That doesn't make sense to me.
Because the central nervous system monopolized the entire control of physiology. So in that sense, you no longer need to consider, like in lower forms of life, right? You might have lots of neural control that are in disparate parts. So if you look at like a lamprey, all the gate control and whatnot is like inside the spinal cord. All of that goes away once the whole behavior is controlled by the central nervous system, and that's why you can take the physiology out of the picture of this, because all of what is now interesting is now inside the behavioral control. That's how I view it. Like if you look at it through evolution, right? If you look like because you kind of start early up, right? It's just some food-seeking entity.
Oops.
Like this, sponges.
Yeah, exactly. There's kind of like a point like where you have a nerve cord and stuff like that. Early on, like into vertebrae, right? Where the physiology becomes irrelevant to the physiology of the body, right? Becomes irrelevant. What it's really all about now is the central nervous system, because it's monopolizing control.
Okay, so you're defining physiology in what sense here?
Physiology of the body, the animal that we're talking about, right? So like that lamprey, right? That you see there, right? It has a physical body, and it has a spinal cord, and it has a central nervous system.
Right.
It does certain things, right?
So when it interacts, it does its fluke thing and moves through the water, and the water exerts pressure on it, and that it's colder, it's hotter, and stuff like that. You're saying that's totally mediated by the central nervous system and not by cellular activity or anything else?
Yes, that is the argument, I guess. At least it's the argument that the diagram makes.
I think the environment pushes back on the physiology in a way that's not represented here. I mean, it's maybe not a salient point for what we're trying to describe, but to me, there's more of
I mean, like, you kind of have to look like how far that is up the chain, right? I mean, like the top point there is life, right? Which is just like replication, so RNA, self-replicating molecules, and metabolism, so how do you assemble proteins, right? Yeah. And then the metabolism is divided up into some kind of physical entity that lives. I guess that's physiology, and what it does. Right? Swim around with like a
So this physiology is not neurophysiology. This is body shape.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, I know. I just want to maybe there's a clarification. Because we talk about physiology around here, we're almost always talking about neurophysiology, which is the behavior of neurons, which would be on the right side there, not on the left side. Maybe that's a little bit confusing.
At the split, endoderm and ectoderm, it's basically saying everything in your gut, that's what endoderm is not to be looked at, and we're looking at everything that's at the skin level and sensory level, I guess is what he's trying to say, as it evolves from the blastome.
Maybe. Diagrams like this are useful to an extent, but obviously they're wildly inaccurate in many ways, right? You can't make a diagram like this. It's probably impossible to make the correct diagram like this. So I view this as sort of a thought experiment to help you think about things a little bit. each one of these nodes and connections it's much more complicated and not completely understood. So I think we can't read, all I'm saying is it's a good way of thinking about something, but you can't read too much into this diagram. So when I saw the dead end of physiology, I interpreted that the author just didn't want to talk about that, so we're just going on talking about this.
Yeah.
It's not like it really ended there. I don't know, that's how I looked at it. And you'll notice the word behavior is in a larger font, so you say, pay more attention to here, we're going to talk about this stuff.
So this is really a mind map in some sense.
It's to help you to think about maybe what the author's thinking about. I don't know. I don't think you can read too much into it. Look, and Matt put his own labels on it. I think that's part of it too.
Yeah.
It's highly suggestive, and same with this. These are not hard distinctions. I don't think the author meant these as this is the definitive map.
He's just offering an alternative way of thinking about the old taxonomy, which makes sense because at least it does make more sense this way than the old taxonomy to me.
So are we ready for more discussion about this?
Yeah, all day long.
You can take the.
I've been thinking about this for weeks.
I've been thinking about this sort of the flipping around the opposite way this paper presents. As you're arguing this paper, I think, if I understood it, it's like, okay, we got these really old structures, and they do these certain things, and maybe that's the right way to interpret the cortex, what it's doing.
The context of what it's doing.
Yeah, maybe that's the right way of thinking about how the cortex behaves too, which I think is a very valid argument. But now we know something about how the cortex works. We know that it's got these reference frames. We know they're going to be using grid cell-like structures throughout the neocortex, and all behavior is based on reference frames.
Yeah.
I'm certain of that. So we can then, I've been asking myself, well, to what extent does the old brain work on the same principles? Right? Because the old brain still had actions. A reptile moves and behaves in the world and so on. So clearly, like we think about the hippocampus and the adrenal cortex, those are older structures. And we've asked, but how far down in the old brain do you have to go? Can you go and still see something that's built on reference frames? It's an opposite question. It's like saying what we've learned from the cortex, how can we inform what the old brain works like? And this is like giving the old brain works this way, what we can infer about the cortex. So I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong. I'm saying two different ways of asking the same questions. So we've learned something about the cortex, which is really important.
Yeah.
And now I'm starting to ask myself, well, how far down in the old brain we know the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex, we're going to find place cells and grid cells and head direction cells.
Yeah.
Is there other places? Can you go further down in the tectum or something? I don't know. At the point where an animal starts acting in a way that they need to know about the structure of the world, a bacterium doesn't really need to know about the structure of the world, right? It just senses, a bacterium moves, changes its direction, and it changes its direction more often when it's when the gradient of food is going down. It turns its direction less often when the gradient of food is going up.
Yeah.
That's pretty simple. There's no structure there. But if an animal knows where it is or has any idea how to get back someplace, and so do birds work on reference frame? I'm pretty sure they do. Do bees? Maybe they do too. I don't know. I'm just asking the question. I have no hypothesis, but I think it's interesting to ask a subsequent question. We say, can we go back the other way and say, given what we know about the cortex, what parts of the old brain might work on similar principles?
Sure.
The interesting, if one thinks about this idea that higher cognitive functions are these things where you need memory, right? You need to be able to act beyond the here and now, right? So the idea being that what cortex really epitomizes is this whole world building, which has nothing to do with what to do here and now, but way later, right? And so in that sense, we can sort of look forward where are the early beginnings of that kind of a thing, right?
Yes.
Like delayed behavior and things like that. Right? And so, for people who are looking at the hippocampus, for example, right? I guess it's not all that surprising that it's both structure for space, representing grid cells and place cells and quarter cells and whatnot, but it is also the memory structure, because that is the very first kind of memory that was most important to hold on to. Where it's home, where it's food.
How do I get there?
Right. How do I get there? Path integration.
Yes.
Right. And so all the things that the hippocampus does, presumably there must be ways to to have some kind of sort of delayed things and world building even before that. I mean, that is the most obvious one.
Take bees, right? So look at the waggle dance and all this stuff. Now I have no idea if the bee is structured. They might have a completely different structure, but in some sense the bee has to remember what direction and distance
Right.
It was to something. Now, there could be just a totally specialized circuit to do that, and it's not general purpose at all. That's probably likely. But it's an interesting question: is there something a little bit more sophisticated than that? And I haven't looked at this at all. But what's up from bees? What about a simple reptile or another type of an octopus or this kind of fish or something? I don't know.
Well, for bees, since it's a social insect, it's much more interesting because they actually perform the dance.
Yeah, that's what I said. The waggle dance. Yeah.
The waggle dance.
Yeah. No, my point is, so they have to have some memory which they possess, which they now transfer to someone else, right? So it requires memory. The bee of some sort. But they're very easily. The bee is a very simple animal, so it could very well be the bee has just some specialized circuit that just solves that one problem, and that's it. Where an octopus clearly is much more sophisticated. And an octopus doesn't have a neocortex per se, but it's got a pretty sophisticated brain, and they're really smart. And so it's just an interesting question to ask. To me, knowledge about the world requires reference names. I've kind of come to believe this. If you're going to have any kind of general purpose knowledge, it can be applied in different situations. And so other animals, non-mammals, have abilities to express knowledge about the world. And so to what level does this basic idea of reference frames, when does it end? How far down does it go? I don't know. I'm just posing it as a question. It's just something I thought about. It's not like I've ever done any research on.
I don't know either, but I do. I mean, one of my key takeaways here is that it really feels like what he calls action selection is object-centric reference frames.
Yeah.
What he calls action specification is body-centric or sensor-centric
Yeah.
reference frames, which is a hint, how these could be working together.
Yeah. One of my criticisms of diagrams like this is that by putting all these different words in these different vertices here, it's sort of
It's like biting.
It suggests that there are special circuits for these things, and that is certainly true in the old brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't argue against that at all. But when you come to the cortex, we still see these kind of words in most people, whether the author of this paper meant it or not, but most people still think there's some sort of special circuit for that. And I think the underlying, the overlaying theme of our research here has been that no, there's we go with Mountcastle. There's one circuit that does everything,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's the thing I find. There's nothing wrong about these diagrams, but it leads people to sort of forget that we're trying to find a common cortical algorithm.
Well, at least it's like one big green bubble.
Yes, but
Right?
there are
Like
still.
it break apart different areas of cortex, right?
Yes, but
So-
most neuroscientists still believe that the different areas of the cortex are performing fundamentally different intrinsic functions,
Right.
and I don't believe that.
Yeah, but it's also just ignoring evolution. Like the time scale that green bubble is.
Yes.
Compared to the millions.
Yeah, that was
hundreds of millions of years.
Mountcastle's argument in his original essay. It was like,
That's still true.
70% of the grain grew in the last few 100,000 years, and the rest of it took a billion years. So it's like,
Yeah.
And he did say somewhere something about heterogeneous functional representations throughout the cortex. So
Well,
he mentioned Mountcastle, but he also mentioned the different functionality in different parts of cortex.
well, that's true. Right? There is heterogeneous function, but homogeneous intrinsic function, which is the mind-blowing concept of Mountcastle.
Right. Here's something interesting. Prefrontal decisions appear to evolve through the collection of votes for categorically selecting one action over others. So that aligns too.
Did you talk about, there's a whole bunch of literature about this action selection going through the basal ganglia?
He did talk about the basal ganglia.
Because that's very confusing to me, and
He didn't dwell on it though. I didn't.
okay. I mean, it's a very, I don't know. I just wonder if there's anything that we could learn from this paper. Yeah, there he has it right there.
Yeah.
Going down to behavioral biasing, right? Okay, yeah. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. It's very hard to interpret that, because the basal ganglia, of course, is not one thing. It's a lot of things.
Yeah, biasing inputs.
Yeah, and he says the compromising candidate is that basal ganglia?
Yeah, this is
Black
basal
box?
ganglia.
Oh, I see. Basal ganglia.
I mean, they have all these structures, right? For signal, reward,
Mhm.
expectation, like.
So this is sort of a very high level perspective on how to think about all this evolution, which is great.
Yeah.
We of course take it to the level we want to understand the low level structure as well.
Yeah. I was happy to find something that aligned with how I thought. And honestly, I've always been really curious about what and where, and those pathways and the way he describes it. I'm a little confused about these arrows, in the middle going everywhere. But it makes sense that there's objects and there's actions and they go together. There's simultaneous selection of objects and actions throughout cortex as you're performing tasks.
I like the word affordance, and this isn't the first time it's come up here. Jeff's got affordances before. Sometimes I don't know. It's useful to sometimes take the word object and insert the word affordance instead. We're surrounded by affordances. We're surrounded by things we can, like you recognize a handle, you recognize a way you can go and get water into your mouth. I don't know. That's a useful idea that sometimes when we say objects, maybe sometimes just for our own thought processes, we can substitute the word affordance, see what that suggests, and it's a nice suggestive word.
Totally agree.
It makes more sense than a thousand brain,
And it just makes sense that hey, we're these living organisms moving around the world. We don't need to recognize particular coffee cups. We're kind of recognizing affordances. We're recognizing things we can use to do things.
Although we do both, right? We do recognize. Now we'll know that's your water bottle, right?
Yes, you do.
And
but the reason why you can do it is
because we talked about this is why I think this attention piece of this is really important, because I think the affordances go with attention, right? I have a new structure, I've never seen it before, but I attend to the components which look similar to things I've seen before, and I recognize a handle and I don't know the word for that little metal thing that's holding the handle to the side of your lid there, those circular metal things, but I recognize that too as sort of a hinge. It's a pin for hinge, right? And so it's both. We can look at it, so we can go into a novel environment. I think you may even brought that up once early on about going to a novel room, but we attended to the components and we built a temporary set of object representations, and all of them have affordances. So it's both. I think it's both. You're right. That's right. But I don't think we should ignore the object model either.
Oh, for sure.
Because we do, in the end, whether it's a permanent set of relationships or a temporary set of relationships, we are still building up these spatial relationships between affordances or objects, sub-objects, or something like that. So I think it's a good observation.
That's all I had on this.
Yeah, what do we call behavior before?
They're related.
It's a suggested behavior, right? It's not an action. So affordance is not, a behavior is, I would say, you do this. You have to be careful, because an affordance is a suggested behavior. Or
Think of it like
associated behavior. I mean, behavior associated with something.
I like to think of it as an object. So think about reaching into a black box and moving your hand across something. Affordances are all the potential objects it might be. And in the same way that potentially selecting an action in response to...
I guess I find that hard.
Really?
Here's the definition. Affordances are an object's properties that show the possible actions users can take with it,
Yes.
thereby suggesting how they may interact with that object. And James Gibson coined affordance in 1977, referring to all action possibilities depending on the user's physical capabilities.
I think that's pretty close to the definition I gave earlier.
Yeah.
So it's not just the object, it's the suggested behavior of the object, which is the important thing.
But perhaps that's represented in the ventral stream in parallel, right?
Well,
the behavior of it.
now we'll talk about where it is a separate question. But what is an affordance? I have a little difficulty saying an object is an affordance. An object suggests affordances. So it's associated. But an object is still an object. A coffee cup is a coffee cup. It has its structure, its shape, its morphology, and parts of that morphology suggest behaviors. Parts
Yes. I guess my point is not that affordances and objects are the same, but the same function is manipulating them. It's the cortical column is manipulating affordances in one part of the brain and objects in another part of the brain as if they were the same sort of thing in different reference frames.
I guess I don't like putting them in different parts of the brain.
Well, just not even ventral versus dorsal?
Well, because again, the ventral columns look very similar to the dorsal columns. And so somehow I would prefer, if it's possible, to say they're doing exactly the same thing, but using different reference frames. That's the distinction.
Right.
And so...
oh, you're saying perhaps...
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying here is if you have what and where, it's a precondition, but the importance is are basically, what can I do with it? What behaviors are appropriate to do with it? And that has nothing to do with what and where. Those are just preconditions to execute on something like that.
Yeah. Imagine I have, yes, I think that's right. Imagine I have some structure represented in a reference frame. And also part of that structure in the reference frame is how to change the structure. I mean, how the morphology can change, or what features at each location can change. That is part of the definition of that structure.
Yeah.
That could be, and I've always made this argument in a wear pathway. Imagine I'm driving my car. There's a set of features relative to my body. And so I can learn that. That is like the controls of my car are like an object in body space.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to use those same controls if they were reversed and I was sitting on the other side of the steering wheel. They're sort of in body space, and therefore I can move. I know how to move my hand to reach this directional signal and do other things. I don't even have to look at it. So that's an object. That's sort of an object in body space. And then whereas my coffee cup is got its own reference frame, and so the point is that where and what pathways can both be thinking about a common. They're both learning the structure of if you call objects and the behaviors of those objects, but one's in a body reference frame and one's in an object reference frame. And I wouldn't call one actions and the other objects. I would say they both have objects and both have behaviors.
Yeah,
Maybe
it's just one's more relevant to actions versus.
No, I don't
Maybe
think so.
another example might be the stapler example. If you think about the stapler as an object,
Yeah.
it has all of these configurations. Those are all of the different possible ways that the stapler could exist in its own reference frame, right? And then if you look at the wear pathway, maybe thinking about a configuration of the stapler, the wear pathway might say, okay, here's my body, here's my hand, here it is in relation. How would I need to change my body's configuration? My body has all these configurations in order to achieve the stapler's configuration. So that would be the what and where working together to.
Yeah.
So one would be like all the different configurations of your arm and how you can move it. And the other is all the different configurations.
So the
of your
stapler is a complex actionable item,
Yeah.
and your body is a complex actionable item. So they both have actions.
Okay.
The actions don't occur in one spot. This becomes important if you're trying to figure out what a cortical column does. You have to constantly look for the commonality between these functions and not their differences. So that's why I kind of react negatively to say, oh, one's doing actions and one's doing objects or something like that.
But you would say that it's important that one's reference frame is body-centric and another is object-centric.
Well, I think that would be the conclusion from the fact that they seem to be doing these things that they're doing, which suggests that's the case. We didn't walk in with that assumption.
Yeah.
The walking in assumption was like, hey, we figured out what a cortical column, how it models the shape of a morphology of a coffee cup. How could that possibly explain the wear pathway?
Yeah.
Because that same mechanism has to explain the wear pathway. So the only answer I could think of was, and it's a good answer, is that, it's doing the exact same thing, except it's the reference frame is anchored to the body. And then everything seems to be the same. So that was a deduced hypothesis versus an observation, just to be clear about that.
Okay.
I think in computer graphics, these are treated very similarly. And the operations of representing different configurations of a stapler using transformation matrices and reference frame of each of the things is exactly how you would represent different configurations of your body. And each thing would have its reference frame and transformations between them. And they're almost identical in how you represent. The computations are almost identical.
But to use that exact same analogy, there's another phase of computer graphics that says, okay, I can visualize the stapler, I can visualize it, open it. I can't open it because it's against a wall. Or I can't, so the rest of the objects also, it's not just that object's reference frame and my reference frame, but projecting that object in its own reference frame, interacting with other objects. That's another aspect of the behavior that guides what our actions are. And so I think there's another level of subtlety here on when we're talking about this rather than being egocentric about it. Because we're actually looking at how we plan things, how we, don't go and say, oh, it's stopped. You can predict, oh, it will be stopped.
That's an interesting sort of constraint on the problem, Kevin. That's an interesting thing to think about. So it immediately suggested possible solutions to that problem. I don't know if you want to speculate on that now. Because we haven't asked ourselves that particular question before, at least I haven't. but we know part of the solution again. Part of the solution is, and we wrote this in the framework paper, is that we think that the cortex is always attending to something constantly, whether it's your vision or hearing or touch. And every time you attend to something, it's going to figure out the relative positions of the two things you attended to. It's just a natural process. I look at you and I look at Michelangelo, and I know how far apart you are. It just happens. It's just part of the process of attending to objects. And so now I have like maybe a wall and I have a stapler, and I obviously will not know the constraint on the stapler unless I also look at the wall. If I'm just looking at the stapler and I don't know the walls, I wouldn't know. But now I've looked at the stapler and I have its reference frame, and I look at the wall and know something about its reference frame. And so for starters, we've speculated that the brain would automatically calculate the distance between those two reference frames in a way we don't really understand yet. We talked about the displacement cells, but the displacement cells are really, we haven't worked it out yet. So, but clearly it's happening. And so maybe I'm just speculating off the top of my head right now. So just sorry about that, but it's an interesting question. So the question is, somehow in the process of attending to the stapler and attending to the wall, the brain calculates the displacement or the distance between those two things, and as part of that, it would know that there would be an interference if I imagined one opening up versus the other. It's an interesting question. We haven't really talked about that one before.
Yeah, in computer graphics it'd be collision detection, but
but a cortical column has to be able to do that. So it's an interesting sort of additional constraint on the problem that we hadn't thought about before, which is good.
It's a complex thing because it requires imagination.
Yeah.
Well, what's that?
Well, it's not immediately obvious that two objects would collide, that they are not, mutually compatible under the actions here that you want to take.
Yeah.
And so you have to imagine, using the stapler, opening the stapler or something to
Yes. Okay.
to
That
know.
kind of imagination.
Right.
Yes. Whether you're conscious of it or not, it's not necessarily conscious imagination, but the idea that. Clearly, I don't have a problem if the stapler is closed and the wall, there's a ceiling on it, no problem. It's only when I imagine opening the stapler and I predict what its new morphology would be.
Right.
Yes, I'm saying it's an interesting, complex problem, but I think it's going to be, my take would be automatically solved in the processes of what a cortical column does when it attends to multiple features. So I guess I'm always trying to put as much burden on a single cortical column to do these computations as possible.
It seems like a very high order brain function to me, at least.
Really? I don't think so.
Yeah, because I can imagine myself, like with reduced, prefrontal cortex activity, right? Sort of like a stupider version of me, right? Just going, so of course I'm going to use it, and it's like, no, it doesn't work.
So here's
again, I mean, it's like a
Let
me-
stupidity, right?
Can I just ask, is the stapler example necessary? Can we use something more normal, like
Yeah.
opening a car door and it's gonna hit a thing
car doors are
outside?
very-
Let me throw it and argue that it's more fundamental than you think it is, because the place cells and grid cells solve this problem in spades. So I'm in a room with a barrier, and I want to get from point A to B. The rat doesn't run into the wall.
Right.
It goes around the barrier. So it's a complex process, but it's being solved in that one combination of place cells and grid cells in the entorhinal cortex and hippocampus. And that would be an argument that this is a fundamental property of the whole action planning process, which is going on in every cortical column.
navigation.
Yeah, it's navigation, but navigation it's navigation of my body. It could also, in some sense, it's a navigation. We're talking about an object's behavior, like the stapler or the car door. But I'm at least arguing that, as I move my finger from the side of the cell phone to if I want to touch the power button, it's automatically going to know that there's an obstacle and I have to get around it and just somehow get a different way there. So it's a pretty fundamental property because it's solved. We know it's solved in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. And therefore, I'd be arguing I'm actually arguing it's occurring all the time. You're not aware of it. Is I'm walking down the hall, I move my foot out of the way of a little protuberance on the wall. I'm not even thinking about it, right? I'm just saying, well, let me imagine when my foot's going to hit this thing. You just kind of move a little this way, move a little that way. I want to pick up this thing over here. I automatically go around the water bottle. It's not like I'm not thinking hard about this stuff.
I am thinking hard though when I'm opening the car door.
Why?
At least I have the feeling that I have to pay conscious attention to the fact that I might not want to open the car door now because somebody might be coming from behind, or it might not open all the way because another car
So here's the tricky thing about this conscious attention stuff, is that if I ask you, and you'll say, yes, I'm aware of it, because you'll think about it. But I argue that most of the time you're not thinking, you're not aware of it. Your brain's thinking about it, but you're not aware of it. So the last several weeks, I've been taking my mother in and out of my car door multiple times a day, right? And she needs a lot of help. And so I was actually thinking about this because every time I open the door, I have to be aware of other things that are nearby. Where's her cane? Where's her her walker? Where's the car next door? But I'm really taking there's so many things going on at once, and I'm watching where her foot is. Is it getting stuck in the door jamb? So I'm not going really slow about this, though. I'm not sitting there going, okay, check the foot, check the door, check the handle. It just sort of all flows. But if I stop and think about it, I say, oh, I thought about that, and I thought about that, and I thought about that. But most of the times, you're just doing it.
Okay.
So I'm arguing that it's more subconscious than you think.
Implying less need for attention.
Yeah, or the seatbelt's stuck on her purse. I mean, all this stuff just happens, and you don't. It's just like.
When you're walking, you avoid the obstacles.
Yeah.
Yeah, you try to do the lay with the little robot, you're gonna have to think about before you hit.
Yeah, I think thinking about walking is perfectly. Almost every time you walk, you're avoiding things and things, but you're not thinking about it. But if I asked you, you say, oh yeah, I thought about that.
Well, I think it's more interesting to use that analogy. If you're moving faster than the crowd around you, and they're all moving, and you're navigating around that, and it's unconscious. You just see opening because you have in your mind, the behavior of the person. You gauging it and saying, no one's moving faster than me. No one's moving. They can only move in this space with a certain time. And I navigate a path because I walk faster than most people, as it turns out. So it's all unconscious. It's all stream. And you're right. I'm only aware that I'm expending energy. I'm not deciding from moment to moment.
Well, you're just not conscious about it.
No.
I think there's distinction between. I think your brain's solving these problems constantly. That's the point, right?
I agree. I totally agree
Yeah.
that there is something being solved and done. But if I stop to think about it, it'll all fall apart because I can't move. I can't think about it fast enough.
Well, it would be slower. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Or I adjust myself and move with the same speed of the crowd, and then it's a simpler problem. But a lot of the things that we looked at with the rat in the maze and stuff like that, these are static things. But what happens when there's a lot of moving parts, multiple moving parts, and we still manage to do the right thing, and the rat presumably does that too, when there's multiple rats running down the sewer.
That's the weird thing is it's no longer an affordance, it's like a meta affordance, right? You're no longer just thinking about what are the things you can do with the object. How can you walk around that object? How can you touch or avoid that object, right? You're also thinking about, okay, that person in front of me has just now been cut off by some buggy or something.
Yeah.
So that person's going to go out of the way now. So that little corner there that I wanted to, that opening to the right that I wanted to walk through, that's going to close now.
Yeah.
In a quarter second, right?
Yeah.
Because she's going to step right.
Yeah.
And so you're not just thinking about your affordances. Right? You're also thinking about the affordances of
the other. So I think if you take the 1,000 brains hypothesis, every column is doing all this stuff. It's always. We don't really understand how behaviors are generated from a collection of columns, but in my mind, they're all doing all this stuff, and you're just not aware of it most of the time. But if you stop and attend to anything in particular, then you'll be aware of it, and you say, oh yeah, I was thinking about that. But 90% of the time, you're not thinking about it at all. You just do it. I'm even just you move my arms and knowing where that chair is going. I wasn't thinking about the chair, but there's an obstacle here, I'm hitting it, but it's just amazing. I think just so much is going on in parallel that you're just not aware of. Anyway, we're just brainstorming here.
Yeah, we just got quite a bit away from that.
Yeah, well, that's a good thing about a paper like this, right? It gets you thinking about
That's imagination,
Yeah. So this paper, there's a recent one, was this year, 2000, what was it?
2019, this one, the phylogenetic paper, it's resynthesizing behavior through phylogenetic refinement.
And the journal is Attention, Perception, and Psychophysics.
Yeah.
And there is a very good video of a talk he gave where he really just starts out with the most basic life form, just a life form that can move forward or stop. and then a life form that has eyes, you know, that can decide left, right, and then a life form that can bias its actions, and a life form that, and it's like always like adding every time he like expands the circuits. Well, if you wanted to now control that circuit below to do something more complex, what would you need to introduce? And so like he essentially gradually builds a brain, right, starting with the oldest brain structures, right, and you know, I like in that video that I saw, I think it didn't go all the way up to cortex, you know, but it was very nice in sort of explaining the, you know, likely evolutionary origin and trajectory of brain development. So the phylogenetic.
That is an easy talk to find. How do I?
It's on the forum. I'll find it and send a link
You can
out.
just repost the link maybe.
Yeah.
I just thought it was very nice because it's like super visual.
Yeah.
He has like this example of like, well, here's another situation. It's like, you know, how would the life form now optimize for survival and reproduction, right?
And his specialty is what? Because this paper is like physics, perception. What is just scroll down to what does it say about his name? Keep going down right there. He is Department of Neuroscience.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's still at University of Montreal.
That's his university.
I wonder how deep the neuroscience goes. I mean, there's different levels of neuroscience, right? This is a.
He's the
What's
primary
Department of
author on this.
Physiology. So I guess.
It said that? Where did it say that?
Yeah, right there, physiology.
Oh, right there, Department of Physiology.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why is it? It says Department of Physiology, then it said Department of Neuroscience.
He's
I don't know.
watching the live stream and
This was-
screaming who he is
Right,
right
yeah,
now.
right.
This was 12 years old, so he may have moved.
I don't know.
I don't
No, guys, do your research.
Sorry, Paul, we love your paper. Well, you know, just because everyone has a sort of different, these are very different fields, and some people talk about the same things using different markers.
Yeah.
It's very difficult sometimes. I mean, we very rarely go down to these very low-level detailed mechanisms, neural mechanisms. There's a lot of work that's done at this level of abstraction. And sometimes it's hard to get back and forth between them.
Okay,
Right.
well, it was a pleasure to read these papers. I thought they were good. And Dr. Cisek, if you're watching, please like and subscribe.
Retweet it.
Retweet, share as much as you want. Thanks for your work. We appreciate it.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, let me go. I got to figure out how to go offline here. Hold on.
Montreal is like one of
end
those
stream.
historically.
Oh. Thank you, Falco. He's the one. He's been chatting the whole time. Okay.
Historically, like great